ahead and get this webinar session started. So welcome everybody to today's team coaching webinar. We are excited to have you all joining the session today. Alex and I have been co-hosting a webinar series this fall, and really the theme for this webinar series is really just having a space to really challenge our assumptions and thinking as team coaches. As this field starts to heat up a bit, we really wanted to create some spaces where we could come together and really in a more informal, relaxed setting, really just share some of our thinking on various topics that really could help all of us as team coaches raise the level of our effectiveness. And so that's really the spirit of the webinars. And so rather than go down the route of a formal presentation by an expert, we thought it could be fun to just bring a few folks together who have some backgrounds in team coaching and kick around some ideas, get a conversation started, including with all of you, and just see where the conversation goes. And so, this is the idea here is not to prepare too much, not to crowd this space with too much preparation, but really to see what we can co-create together in this hour on a topic. And so, we'll kick it off and share some thinking and ideas, and then, we'll open up to you. Feel free to use the chat window liberally during the session. A little bit later, we'll be able to, you can unmute and pop on and ask comments and make questions. So, that'll be sort of the format. Just so you know, this session is being recorded, only the audio portion though. And so what I do is I make a replay available for folks who are working today or in other parts of the world and who can attend. And so just so you know that the chat window transcript won't be put up on the website, but it's just the audio version of the recording tonight, so we can sort of deal with the asynchronous learning and give people an opportunity to participate. So with that, without further ado, why don't we just jump in a little bit? Alex, anything you want to say at the outset as my co-host today?
Yeah, I think it would just be helpful to say that we decided on the topic for today, the core competencies of team coaching, sort of as a result of our webinar last month, which was discussing the similarities and differences between team coaching and other kinds of group interventions. And although we sort of strayed from that original topic, there seemed to be a lot of energy with the people that joined us around talking about what really constitutes or what constitutes competencies around team coaching, right? Do most of our individual certifications and trainings for individual coaching, are all those subsumed up into team coaching competencies? And if so, how do we distinguish what is necessary for an effective group and team coach? So for those of us that weren't able to join us last time, thank you for being here today. Really the point of us, like Christopher said, is just to expand on what makes a good team and group coach. And today we're trying to hopefully open the forum or the sandbox, as Jason likes to say, in terms of what do we need to talk about as a field in terms of competencies. So we'll hope that you'll join us in the chat. Please do. I'll be keeping an eye on that and bringing those into the discussion. And don't be shy. The more you guys get involved, the richer this conversation gets. So thank you all for being here. Great.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Alex. And so just so everybody knows, we have 5 sort of panelists, so-called panelists on the session today. It's myself, Christopher Lowe. I'm a host of the podcast, and I've been really fortunate to have all of the other panelists on the podcast. And I think, Jennifer, maybe you were one of the early ones back earlier this year. Alex, not too long ago, we did an episode with you with Pam Van Dyke, who's not able to show up on video today, who's here, and then Terry Malpia, a recent guest on the podcast. So I think without long introduction, just so we can maximize our time together, maybe I'll just share briefly about you, and if there's anything else you want to add, jump in. So Alex Duran, founder of Frable Consulting, an executive coach, initially started with millennial coaching and now expanding into team coaching and other sort of leadership coaching. We have Jen Britton, a real pioneer in group and team coaching. One of her books, From Many to One, Best Practices in Group and Team Coaching, probably should be on the shelf of every would-be team coach, as I have it back here.
I brought mine with me.
There you go. So Jen has hers, and has, she talks about competencies in here for team coaching. So it's really great to have Jen on, and based in Toronto, Canada, does a lot of team and group coach training programs, both face-to-face as well as virtually. We've got Pam Van Dyke with the Van Dyke Resource Group. She's out in Texas, recent podcast guest. She presented at the Columbia Coaching Conference last October. That's where I met Pam. And she actually did a dissertation on group and team coaching. And so some of her model around group and team coaching really is influenced by some, rigorous research. And then, Terry Malpia, who all of you I'm sure know is faculty director of the coaching program at Columbia. And I think we did a real fun 2-part episode recently on frontiers in executive and team coaching. So that's the quick, introductions to the panelists today. Obviously, each of the guests, there's a lot more behind these folks, but I think we would take up the whole hour if we dove into the bio. So let's skip over that and jump in a little bit. I thought as a way of getting started would be to maybe just do a little go around and just let's start, cooking the conversation today. When you think about the core competencies of team coaching, how do you think about that? And what are some of the things that, you have written about on that, or you're thinking about that, anything that comes to your mind? And would any of the panelists like to begin? I'm happy to kick off, but I oftentimes do that. So I'm happy for another person to kick us off and share a few thoughts to get us going.
Well, Jen, I'd love to hear, Jen, what you have to say and how sort of get us started, given the expertise carrying this field. And I think it'd be a great place to just hear what your thoughts are.
Great. Well, I'm so excited to be here, and I'm also really excited we didn't have to come prepared. And I think handwritten notes are always a good thing because part of our work is really about working on our feet. So I'll just kick the ball off rolling by saying, as coaching in and of a profession really starts to establish itself, I think it's so important that we're all leading from a common frame. And as Krista was talking about my book, From One to Many, which has almost been out in the marketplace for more than almost 3 years now, I felt really compelled that it was important that we help also educate people still about what are the core coaching competencies. So whether we're using the ICF framework or other, some of the things I like to continue to share with my clients, whether they're teams or organizations, and coaches new to this field, really, one of the distinguishing factors is our deep focus on goals and helping that entity we're working with deepen the awareness as well as forward the action. And that's something a little different than probably most of us on this call who might have started off in the training or facilitation field. I started out working with groups almost 30 years ago now. It's hard to believe, and yes, I was a young age, but it really is a little different when I am engaged as a coach to have that deeper relationship with people. So one of the things I've been continuing to think about is the role of co-facilitation. Whether or not it's an actual competency that we want to add into the work that we do, I think co-facilitation, collaboration is absolutely critical. And in fact, next month, I think it's the first week of November, I'll be speaking to the ICF team and group coaching community of practice on collaboration. It's an area that we don't always start digging into yet. When we do enter into the team environment, even the group environment, we're leaving that, unicentric focus behind. So I just offer that out as, a place of inquiry, a place that we don't often talk about or explore that is beyond our core competencies unless we look at co-creating the environment, and co-creating a relationship is actually how ICF frames it. So really this work is constantly being designed and constantly being expanded in different ways. So I'll pause here and let some of the other panelists chime in.
Mm.
Well, Jen, it really, what resonates with me is this concept that if we as coaches are showing up at the group or team level, that our own presence has to be more than one person, right? So that if we are coaching or facilitating or consulting or training more than one individual or more than a dyad, that we as the people hired to do that work need to also bring that level of system. Is that fair, that there needs to be some sort of synchronicity between the level of system that the coaches who are hired or brought in to do the work also in some way represent the level at which they are going to work? Or is that sort of an oversimplification of it?
Well, I like it's a different spin, but I like it. And again, there may be instances where it's really important that we mirror more of the system that we're working with. And again, I think this has probably been the topic of past podcasts and areas. Our work is so diverse these days. What makes sense in each and every entity? We also want to notice what impact are we having on the system in which we're working? Are we overpowering the system? I think at a base level, we want to make sure that we are in collaboration with the people that we are serving. And that collaboration is going to look different from Team A to Team Z. So I know, like, your spin, though, Alex, on, the reflective nature, and that's, part of mirroring back, one of our core coaching skills as well.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess, when I came to team coaching, not from the coaching side first, it was really more from the training and facilitation side and consulting, and then making my way into team coaching. And so I guess the way I think about it is, if I think about the phases of a team coaching engagement, and when I think about the 35 podcasts that we've done, while everybody has sort of some unique elements to their team coaching model, I think, Jen, maybe your team coaching model around best practices as well captures this. There are kind of like some overarching similarities across all models despite their differences, right? There's kind of a diagnostic or discovery phase. There's oftentimes, but not exclusively, a kickoff stage where bring a team together and kick off a team coaching type of engagement, and then there's sort of an ongoing coaching piece. So it's a very basic three-phase team coaching approach. So when I think about the phases of a team coaching engagement, then that reveals to me a little bit more of some of the core competencies. And I would make a little bit of distinction between like core competencies and then maybe tertiary or secondary competencies. Because I think anybody who's done deep work with teams knows, the rabbit hole just keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. So I guess on a surface level, for me, the way that breaks down is when I think about that discovery phase, there's a whole set of competencies around what I would call consulting competencies, which are really around contracting, really around needs assessment, doing some, data collection and feedback. I don't think you need to use instruments, but I notice a lot of team coaches are using individual level as well as team level instruments, and a lot of that happens in the discovery phase. So I think in there it's like skills around interviewing, surveying, other sort of data collection and methodology. So for me, there's a bucket of competencies around consulting. I think when you get into the realm of kickoff workshops, that kickoff, that's really, for me, really a range of facilitation skills. So really, how do you design and facilitate adult learning? And I think that's really a whole another set of competencies. And I think for me, this is the pathway I enter into team coaching. It's starting with consulting, bringing facilitation and training, and then it's really, I think, where the coaching piece comes in. And I really, I feel like a lot of the core competencies of coaching really help you. I think there's some, additional ones around listening to a team voice. I think you need to have another set of competencies just around team dynamics, which may be another bucket around organizational theory or understanding of systems, change, team development, team theory. I think that's like maybe a business acumen or an organizational acumen, which may be another bucket. So I guess for me, there are kind of like four meta categories: the consulting, facilitation, coaching, and a set of business and organizational competencies. And then I think from there you can get fancy and go even more. But I think even that in and of itself is quite a bit. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it. At least my initial
to be a much more
initial pass. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that when we start to have these conversations, it seems to me like it's unlike an individual coaching. We go to interdisciplinary, a mixture of interdisciplinary approaches a lot quicker and a lot less judgmentally than we do when we talk about individual coaching competencies. Because on some level, we recognize that the coaching field as we know it today is not enough to do work effectively in a group and team setting. That's how that sounded to me, Chris. But I'd love to get Pam and Terry in on this and get their.
But just before that, one of the things I think, just to comment and piggyback on what you're saying, Alex, I've had guests on my podcast who have come not from consulting or training or facilitation backgrounds, but came from coaching. And as many of you know, if you're coming up through coaching, you're doing executive coaching, you oftentimes get asked to work with teams. And so some of them have these great stories and they were willing to share of trying to coach a whole team. And I think, Pam, you had a great story of this, but you're not the only one I heard that you knew of somebody who tried to coach every team member as an individual. And that was their first foray into team coaching, and how that, was just impossible and it was too complex and unwieldy, right? So maybe that's a segue over to you, Pam. But
Yeah, this again, much like what the others have shared, this is a great conversation that we should be having as coaches, and so I'm all in and applaud all of our efforts. I think my particular entree into this was really from as a group therapist, and so I started my career as a therapist, and so I think that natural affinity that I had towards groups and teams kind of morphed itself very naturally into the group setting, because I kept finding myself working with teams and groups and wanting to put a sense of structure around that. So I look at it much like both Jen and Krista does in regards to kind of a phase type model. And I would say that probably the group process, the group dynamics are kind of important to me from a standpoint of the approach that I take. I was with a team just last week that's going through a pretty significant change. And had I not been able to kind of tap into some of the dynamics that were there, the competency that I have as an executive coach would have kind of fallen flat. And what's interesting is that usually the people who are involved in it are not aware that that's what you're doing. Or that's what you're tapping into. But being able to know those group dynamics and facilitate the process that's happening is really probably where I come into play. It's a little bit my, not only my roots, but where I tend to lean and how I tend to engage in both group and team coaching.
And Pam, I understand that from your research, your doctoral dissertation, which was on group and team coaching, one of the outcomes that you found was the facilitation competencies were really popping out. Is that right?
Yes.
I remember from our podcast interview, yeah.
Yeah, just to give a shout out to Jen's work. Whenever I started doing the research, there was virtually nothing that had been written, and so it was like I felt a little bit like Tom Hanks on in Castaway, trying to get two things to kind of create a spark. And so I'm so delighted that we're in this space of trying to kind of put some framework around it. But it did. It came out of that space of wanting to find the answers and to be competent in that place. And the research that I did really across the board, the folks that were involved, I researched 19 different group coaching teams throughout domestically as well as internationally. And what was one of the common themes was the competencies of the coach. The coach being able to set up the structure, but also the way that the coach facilitated the process. And again, I had to be very careful about researcher bias because I readily heard that, but then I also, that was what I was kind of my gut feeling as well. And so that just kind of underscores that we're still learning, and we have a lot more to learn in regards to this area.
Dr. Malpia, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what I've already heard. I guess I have two maybe framing comments. One is that in many ways I think we're talking about unit of analysis. So we're working on, so what level of system are we entering? So interestingly enough, when I was listening to you, Krista, when I think of adult learning, we think of learning at the individual level, we think of learning at the group and team level, and we think of learning at the systems level. When I was in org psych, we also think about psychology from the individual, team, group, organization, and social level. So whether you're talking about learning, whether you're talking about organizational development, behavior, coaching, I think level of system or level of work, I think, is an important consideration. I also think that it's an interesting exercise, although I'll start with ICF as an example, although I don't know anywhere where ICF makes the unit of analysis statement explicit. Yet as you trace the origins of the practice and the competencies themselves, if you do a content analysis, you can tell that they were written with the assumption of one-on-one interpersonal interventions, even though it's not stated explicitly. And so now that I think the market, however you begin to define that, is driving the need for scalability, we have found ourselves doing derivatives, peer coaching, group coaching, etc. And there's a cultural dynamic because we want the competencies that we created for interpersonal relationships to work for group and organizational, and it may or may not. So I think it raises the question, which of those core competencies work when you expand the level of analysis, or what I would call level of work in more common terms, and then how might many of them need to be expanded, modified, or adjusted. And then, in addition to that, Krista, you gave us a whole smorgasbord of additional competencies.
I'm Swedish, I can't help it. So.
You gave us a whole smorgasbord of additional competencies that may not be
Swedish
included in those. So one, I think, is a level of work question that might be useful for this conversation. The other, and this I would say has to do with my experience with, and I'm not picking on ICF, I'm just going to use them because they're the largest organization and I've had the most dialogue with people from that community and coaching around this, is that we jump into the conversation about competencies. And I've asked on many occasions, what sort of orientation are they using to competencies? Because if you look at the company modeling research and even practice, you'll see that there are different ways of thinking about competencies, right? And so, and they'll begin to tell me how the competencies were created, and that wasn't the question that I was asking, right? I was really asking about orientation. So I'll enter this conversation by saying that the way I think about competencies is really draws on David McCullen. It dates back to Flanagan's work, actually, and David McCullen from Motivational Theme really built on his work, which they created a organization that many of you may be familiar with, which is now called HAY, but initially it was McBurr, which stood for McCullen and Dave Berlew, sort of both of their last names. And they defined competencies on really three levels as knowledge, so what do we need to know? So it raises the question related to team coaching, is what are the knowledge domains that are useful to the work of team coaching? And I think, Krista, you started naming some of them. And then what's the skill set, which is, I think, where most people go when they go to competencies. What are the behaviors? Mm. And then what are the personal attributes that are necessary? So I think those buckets at least help me get clear about knowledge requirements, behavioral requirements, and mindset and or personal attributes that might work. So that's kind of my starting point. What are we talking about when we talk about competency, first of all, and get some conceptual clarity around that. And then unit of work, individual, team, and system.
One of the things that you were saying there triggered for me, Peter Hawkins' work around, he sort of looked at a continuum of team coaching practices. And so they get increasingly systemic as you move from one end of the continuum to the other. So really starting with, and he actually called, I think team training, one form of team coaching, and then moving down the continuum of team development, and then team facilitation, and then process consultation, and then high performance team coaching, and then, leadership team coaching, and then transformational leadership team coaching, and then, systemic team coaching. So I think if you look at it that way as well, probably there's a core set of competencies in there, but as you start doing increasingly sophisticated interventions or coaching, probably there's a whole nother level of systemic competencies, and it kind of ties into what you were saying around levels of system. And I know, Barry Mitch from, Team Advantage, one of the, fascinating things about some of their work is they're, I think, some of the few folks that I've run across who have really scaled team coaching on a larger level. So in my podcast interview with DJ Mitch, she spoke about scaling 60 teams at one time in a pharmaceutical company. And so, I think there you're talking about a whole nother set of organizational change capabilities if you're going to do team coaching like on a scale level, which I think where our field could really start to get exciting, where I think some of the frontier is really scaling team coaching. I think it's more common to come across team coaches who are coaching one team or maybe a couple of teams in a system, but if you think about sort of building a culture of teaming and scaling team coaching, there's a whole other set of change capabilities there around that, which I think is really exciting. And another sort of dimension around that. I know, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the book that General McChrystal came out with called The Team of Teams. And it's really about how in the military there's sort of a need to not only build individual teams who were agile and nimble, but then how do you get lots of teams on a real scale level to be able to kind of collaborate? And I think that it really gets seriously systemic, right? So, Jen, you're getting your smile. It looks like you want to.
Inspired. Again, I think we also want to look at this through the lens of how are we coming to this work? And, some of us on today's call, full-time coaches, have come in through that doorway. We heard your story, Krister. You came through training and facilitation. Many of us came that way. As I've been listening to Terry, I started out with professional coach training when I was still a team leader within the UN. So I was managing a sub-regional team of 30 professionals across 10 countries, really fascinated to be learning as like a newbie coach, okay, I want to have better conversations, but not everything in the one-on-one environment works with the team. That was really my starting point. And everyone I came across in the profession, I'd say, what can I do? What can I bring back to my team or the groups that I'm working with, i.e. community groups, maybe working on literacy, or community groups, women's groups that really wanted to create sustainable livelihoods. And so within that frame, too, again, looking at where are we impacting systems? Where are we, just like you said, the team of teams, I think that's a fascinating approach. And are the skills the same? It's a question I often reflect on. How have my skills also morphed as I have moved from a team coach within my own team to an external coach? And even across the engagements that I do, healthcare to safety to education to public service, it looks different every time. So I think there's a lot. Again, one of the themes that I'm hearing so much today is, one, more need for research. That was why, 6+ years ago, I wrote Effective Group Coaching, my first book, because there was nothing out there. We need to get better at what's the research, what is grounding all of this work, and that's where those of you in education, we really need your voice and your lens and your eyes on, for us as practitioners, what should we be doing? What are the things we need to be looking for? What are the traps we can be getting in, even competencies aside?
Well, I started this work actually as a line sales executive for a Fortune 200 manufacturing firm in packaging, and was a sales manager and so on. But when I made the shift to training, development, OD, and so on, and then coaching, I was always intrigued, especially when I looked at some of the code of ethics. It struck me that the unit of analysis assumption was the individual, because as someone who worked in and for organizations, it became clear to me that some of those assumptions around confidentiality, for example, no longer work when you're with a team, right? And yet, because those competencies are also a cultural artifact, right, of the organization that created it, there could be some unintentional dynamic tension when people begin to expand the unit of analysis, and while they're trying to hold on to some of those ideas that were actually created for a different level of work. And so it's not to say that the competencies aren't useful, but I do think it requires some real thinking around what is the unit of work, and how many of those competencies can we take forward, yet which of them do we have to think through. I went to a New York City chapter ICF meeting recently. David Matthew Pryor was doing a coach demo, and he referenced a book that I hadn't come across. I always love that when that happens. In this space, which I actually found quite intriguing, and I'm actually trying to look for it. But this this book actually begins to challenge some of our thinking about coaching. I think it's actually called Challenge Coaching. I'll find the citation. There's a woman out of the UK, Tatiana. What's her last name? I cannot say it. Bachkirova. I'm showing her book. They wrote a handbook of coaching. She also co-sponsors out of the Cambridge, University of Cambridge coaching program, a conference on coach supervision. But nonetheless, she and some of her colleagues recently wrote a piece that was actually quite provocative, that challenged a number of the assumptions of coach competencies. And that article, and I'll send it to Krista, who then might be able to distribute it to everyone else. But that article began to circulate around the ICF community because I think it got their attention because it was written by a researcher from a very prestigious university. But I think Jenny gets to your point around, in many ways, a lot of the knowledge domains that we're drawing on for team and group coaching already exist in some format, right? Whether it's the various derivatives of organizational behavior, a lot of which is applicable to team coaching, whether it's adult learning, which already has a unit of analysis assumption, or behavior has a unit of analysis assumption. In many ways, a lot of that derives from action research. Krista, you mentioned there's some diagnostic work, some data collection and analysis. There's feedback, action planning, and so on. That's all a derivative of action research. So I think because this work is becoming multidisciplinary, instead of really thinking about fragmenting, and Krista, you heard me say this before, instead of talking about only why coaching or even team coaching is different from facilitation or team training or so on, which I think is an important conversation, if we don't combine that with integration, and because frankly, organizations operate from the domain of integration or they fail to exist. And so I think we may not be doing our participants a service if we stop with coaching is different from therapy or coaching is different from training, it is. And if you look at it, it's also very similar to all those fields. And not continuing that part of the conversation, I think, leaves us in some ways, the credibility of the field is beginning to, the great news is coaching is expanding like wildfire. That's the good news story. The bad news story, as now some people are starting to pay attention to the canons that have emerged from coaching, they're starting to look at this and say, really? So I think we have a challenge and an opportunity to really begin to start thinking in more integrative terms in addition to distinctions, because the distinction makes it seem like we're sort of in that that terrible teen stage of development where we're trying to separate ourselves from others as opposed to being interdependent.
Yay, we got Pam on the video. Just in time, Pam. I was about to ask you, did you want to weigh in? We haven't. Now we can't hear you. Now we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Pam. So we have to work on your mic there. But Terry and I we got into this really at length on the podcast, and that we did, and you talked about sort of the coming of age of the coaching field, and I think that's a really rich conversation there. I want to make sure folks who are listening today get a chance to drop some questions in. If you want to come on the mic and make some comments, this is kind of a free for all, so feel free to drop in the chat that you want to come on, or just unmute yourself and intrude. So. And Because technically, I think if you can mute if you're not speaking, if you're hearing some background noise, that would be great. So Pam, that was you? Okay, that was Pam's mic. Okay. We have a couple questions here in the chat box. So we had Jerome Prives said,
Yep.
who was also a guest of the podcast a ways back. What are some problems that may happen if you stick to an individual level of analysis when working as a team coach? I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that one. Anyone care to?
Could you repeat the question?
So
the question?
The question is, what are some problems that may happen if you stick to an individual level of analysis when working as a team coach? So if you kind of approach a team, but you're really focusing on all the individuals rather than the gestalt of the group.
One of the experiences that I've had actually working with several different coaches to kind of get this nailed down for myself is that approach of working, doing team coaching individually within a team. And it's not that that is ineffective. I think what's the challenge of that is that the other people around don't get the benefit of weighing in on the whole gestalt of it. And so you end up having people basically observing a coach do coaching with an individual. Part of the skill, I think, and the competency that needs to happen for coaches is the ability, if Joe brings up an issue that is being coached in the team or in the group, that the coach has the ability and the skill to bring in the whole team into that process effectively. And that's where I think sometimes it separates the chaff from the wheat, that a lot of times people don't have that skill set. They don't know how to do it. It's not that they don't see it. They do see it. They see that it needs to be addressed, but bringing that in effectively and facilitating that process, I think, is where we still have some learning to do.
And Pam, I think where I would join you in the conversation is in saying, I think that you're right that most team interventionists see it, but I think making meaning of what you're seeing or being aware of what you're seeing is distinct from seeing it. And that if the coach or the interventionist doesn't have the knowledge component, or at least the awareness of some basic interaction of different levels of systems or how systems interact with each other, then the skill isn't going to help them as much because they don't know in what context they're using that skill or that ability. So in my mind, if the team coach or the team interventionist isn't studying up on what happens at different levels of complexity and how, if you're working with a unit of Gestalt or if you're working with the team, how that's actually automatically going to have an effect at all different levels of complexity within that system, then the skill or ability almost falls short, because seeing it is one thing, knowing what to do with it from the get-go is another. So I think that we need to humble ourselves as the interventionist from the beginning and say, if we're going to do team and coach work, team or group work, we need to understand that we are constantly in a learning mode of what is happening in group and team dynamics. Otherwise, all skills will always fall short of our knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to give a real-life example, last week I mentioned this team I was working with. We were doing a kind of a 2-hour team coaching session, and there was one individual within the team that had not really participated. And so I kind of poked that a little bit, and the person began to cry. So this, believe it or not, this is, I wasn't trying to do group therapy or anything like that, but this was in regards to a huge layoff. And these were executives on the team that were needing to go out then and do subsequent layoffs. And so one of the things that, had I not kind of addressed that with the individual, what broke through after that is that the team really got serious and real at a different level than what they had been. It had been very functional, very logistical, and being able to use this individual with her permission to talk a little bit more about what was going on with her really allowed the whole team to really get on board differently, and to get to action, quite frankly, because up until that point they were kind of swirling around the drain, and so this one individual that kind of used as a catalyst, quite frankly, to kind of get the team to the next level.
Yeah, and Pam, I really think I want to reflect back something that you said, which is when you started to tell your story, you said, I wasn't trying to do group therapy or anything like that. And I think that's really indicative of sometimes how as coaches we feel like we start to infringe on a field that we're not supposed to be in. And I think that as we get more comfortable with this space, we have to challenge ourselves to not make apologies for the spaces that our work takes us into, right? Like you saw something, you reacted to it, you went there, and what happened, despite whether it being group therapy or group coaching, was effective. So I think to Terry's point about the stages of development, we need to be less scared about what the demarcations are and understanding that we're more likely to cross boundaries in this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go.
Go ahead, Terry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, just listening to what Pam and Alex just said, there's a lot layered in that. One is, going back to the unit of work question, is if our assumptions of the coaching is that interpersonal, so therefore we do it with a team, we try to do interpersonal coaching at a team level. And I say, okay, if I'm going to shift the work, then what do I need to know? One is what do I know about the way groups develop or form, so the whole classic forming, storming, etc. But also what to look for in groups, right? And what does dialogue look like at the group level compared to dialogue at the interpersonal level, right? So it's not like questioning and listening aren't useful, right? But you're really widening the lens when you're doing questioning and listening in a group conversation than you are in a one-on-one. But it's that, not to critique, but it wouldn't surprise me that if one grew up in the tradition of interpersonal and then they worked to the group, that they would try to bring that to that level of work, which actually all the others are kind of wondering, why am I here?
If I can throw in, I love what we've been hearing. Actually, I'd written down early on before I jumped on this about assumptions and patterns. I think one of the things we become so aware of in this work that is beyond, what we would see in an individual conversation is those patterns that show up. The assumptions, the explicit assumptions, and the under the waterline assumptions that go on that shape a team every day. And again, I don't think this is the context that I saw in the chat, distinction between team and group, because there are distinctions. And as someone who works and writes and researches across both, we also need to recognize that coaching a group is different than coaching a team. There are different skill sets involved. And, again, nuances and add-ons. And I just loved what Terry said. I think just where I started off, all of our core coaching competencies are still valid, but they may look a little different. They are morphed in a group and in a team coaching context, and then we need to add on even more of these skills. So I think this has been a phenomenal conversation today because, again, 5 practitioners, 5 different lenses, and imagine how many hundreds of others are listening to us. And just a couple of things, I'm sure all of us are aware of it. There are different, from what I'm aware of, different pockets of research that are going on right now as well. Discussions within the ICF, other researchers who are looking at how do we get down to some of these competency levels. So I don't know what our best body is for putting all that data together, but we do need more of a repository, I think, for this work. And Krister, your podcast series really has been creating in a very short amount of time just a wonderful vehicle and repository for data for those of us in this field, academics and practitioners.
Well, one good news, thank you for that nod. One good news is I'm starting to get contacted by doctoral students who are doing dissertations on team coaching. So the number of team coaching dissertations coming out, I think that's really going to help, because I know you've cited in our podcast interview an Anthony Grant coaching survey of all the sort of studies of coaching that had existed up until like 2009, and only like 5 out of the 500 or so were focused on group or team coaching. And so my guess is you do that in a couple of years from now, and that number is going to really explode a lot more. So I think that'll help, with the development of this emerging field. But there was some additional comments here, and I see Barry Mitch has popped on, so I'm going to give him the floor here in a moment. I got a couple of private messages that came to me as an organizer. I just wanted to share those out, and if anybody wants to tackle them, to pop them out here. So one of them was within the coaching mega competency, so the mega competency of coaching, what is different or distinct for teams? So I think for this person, really kind of, when you think about coaching in a really broad way, what is really distinct when it comes to teams? If anybody wants to tackle that one. And then we had another one, which I put public here, is what are some U.S.-based team coach training programs excelling at building outstanding team coach competencies? So I think on that one, I can respond to that. I'm sort of aware of 5 or 6 team coach training programs. Jen is one of them. Barry Mitch, who I've been gone through the Team Advantage program. There are a handful of, I would say, outstanding team coach training programs. So there's very few out there that I know. I've come across about 5 or 6. Which one of those is outstanding around team coach competencies? I'd have to leave it probably to the founders of those programs to distinguish. But anyways, while you're on, Barry, did you want to jump in here and add to the conversation today?
Just one thing. When we talk, we've been focusing on the competencies of the coach. And in our experience, when we look at Terrence's knowledge, skills, and attributes, we look at knowledge, skills, and attributes of the coach. And what we have found when we're working with a team, it's not a leaderless team. It's a team with a leader. Mm-hmm. And you have to take the other dimension of the knowledge, skills, and attributes of the team leader come into play as well. So that becomes an extremely important factor in a successful team coaching engagement, is that dimension of the team leader, and also the sort of the dynamics of the coach and the team leader. So I just want to throw that out as another dimension of that.
And Barry, I would add to the complexity of what you just said, because it is in the dynamic, right, that it's not only the competencies of the coach and the competencies of the team leader, but if we think about the team as having resources, right, of the individual members, it's really the competencies of the members. Because if we think about team effectiveness, I like simple equations because I was a sales guy, but if you think about team effectiveness, it's really about the resources that we have at our disposal in terms of capabilities and other resources, minus process loss. Things like conflict, our ability to not communicate, and so on, right? So to me, very simply, when I look at teams that were high-performing when I was in an organization in terms of generating results, the ones that could minimize process loss were often, even if they weren't the most talented, could actually sometimes outperform those who had more, quote, resources. So it's really that interplay between the resources of the leader, the resources of the helper, in this case a coach, but also the competencies of a team. What does it require when I'm an individual contributor in an organization, but I'm also a part of an executive team? And to me, that's the classic example where we have great individual leaders, but yet they're an awful member of the executive team, and the tension that creates in the organization.
Well, and I think that for me, this brings up a point that I've been thinking about recently, which is I don't think it's as important that we narrow team coaching or group coaching competencies down to a list of 5, right? I don't think that the goal that any of us are trying to get to is a strict boundary of competencies, because what happens in that case is if we all train or we all get certified, whatever it is, around a certain amount of competencies, then we're all going to get the bias of showing up in a specific way rather than adapting ourselves as instrument to what the team or group coaching dynamic needs, right? So and use of instrument as self, and to Barry and yours point, and to your point, Terry, it's listening to the competencies of the team and the leader and saying, how do I need to show up for them given the contracting that we've done, which Krister mentioned at the beginning of our session today, and then looking at perhaps your competency bank and saying, okay, I need to pull from this, this, and this, and that evolves throughout the engagement as the team and group dynamic also evolves. So I think that we need to be conscientious that when we talk about competencies, that we're not trying to all just adhere to 4 or 5, but that we are acknowledging that we are trying to develop as best as we can as the instrument to be adaptable and flexible to the engagements that we're showing up to.
Yeah, dancing has to be a competency, Alex.
Dancing.
Dancing.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fair.
I mean, and I would throw, I mean, we haven't even spoken about the role of technology, and I know, Jennifer, this is one of your areas of expertise, but you know, whether it's using GoToMeeting, telephone, coaching with the group, all of those technologies. I know, Alex, when we spoke, you were talking about Periscope and other new technologies emerging. I mean, I'm struck at how just in my own work, how it's just, I've been forced over the last 5 years to bring, do more of my work through the wires, and so that's a whole nother set of competencies that we haven't even touched on that today.
And it's key, look at our teams. Where are our teams located? Are they co-located anymore? 15, 20 years ago, none of my teams ever saw each other except for once a year. We were on long-range radio. We didn't even have the internet. So how do you connect people in a jungle environment, and build a team?
Right.
So again, I think there are a lot of areas, and I'm sure, Krister, you want to sort of wrap us up in a few minutes, but
yeah.
3 questions I've written down as we've talked today, which I think beyond competencies, we always want to be asking what's needed here. What's the purpose of this work? What's needed? And what's my role? Because as I think all of us have touched on, this work can be looking at so nuanced. And as multidisciplinarians, I did my graduate degree as a multidisciplinarian for the first time 25, 30 years ago. It was really uncomfortable at times to be crossing boundaries. I was originally trained as a psychologist, then I went into the field of environmental studies, where I was moving from ecology to OD to facilitation to, power relationships and critical education. It's uncomfortable. So how do we also create more spaces like this where we can have the varied approaches, varied dialogues happening, whether it's live, by chat, in person, and external. So thanks. I've really enjoyed my time here today.
Thank you, Jen. Well, that's a great closing comment from you. Maybe we can go around the horn. Terry, do you want to sum up a closing comment for you today?
Sure.
Or you can punt if you want for a little bit.
I'll punt for a moment.
Pam, are you ready to share anything in closing today, or?
Sure. What's great? I'm kind of with Jen on. This is a great conversation for us to have, and we're the folks that need to be having it. And I think that we've come a little ways down the path, but it just reiterates to me we've got some ways to go, and I'm excited to be on the journey. And I think your podcast, so to speak, Krister, is bred for the journey as we kind of embark upon this. And more research is coming our way, and it's all exciting. So I'm glad.
Cool. You ready to chime in yet, Terry? You still punting for a little bit longer?
Yeah, I mean, I think my insight has been just reinforced based on sort of listening to everyone's entry and the conversation, which for me is really thinking really about what are the competencies that can move over easily to what are the sort of one-on-one competencies, coaching competencies that can move over easily to team coaching, which of those competencies need to be modified, and then importantly, what are the new competencies that have not been articulated in the existing frameworks by major professional associations in the coaching space. And my intrigue around crossing in academia we're talking about crossing disciplinary boundaries, yet in practice I'm seeing now the need to be able to cross practice boundaries. Because interestingly enough, the same silos that have been created in the academy, I'm actually now seeing show up in practice. I'm a coach, I'm a facilitator, I'm a trainer. And I think our clients are confused as hell.
Thank you, Terry. Alex, do you have a closing comment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that sticks with me is what a lot of us know, which is that practice will often outpace the research world, right? And how do we, as the people having these conversations, help those who have the resources to do the research to shorten that distance between the pace of practice and the research as well. And I just want to take a moment to thank the panelists that were able to join us today. Thank you for enhancing the richness of this discussion. It's one thing for Krista and I to be here, but it's multiplicatively more rich because of all of you and all of our attendees and the questions that they ask for us. And please, as you reflect on what sticks with you over the next couple of days about today, shoot us a note about what you want to keep thinking about, learning about, discussing. This is the community that we're trying to use to push each other to really think critically about where we are. And so you are all a part of this with us, and we hope that you'll give us your feedback in terms of what you want to keep talking about. Thank you for joining us, and I think next month we'll still have one more. So we hope that all of you will be able to join us then.
Awesome. Well, my closing comment is, I dove into this sort of arena, I guess, in January, kicking off my podcast, and I've really felt a change in the chatter, so to speak, around team coaching. I feel like there's a growing hunger. The amount of emails that I get from folks, out there who are interested in the topic really just seems like it's ramping up. And, my guess is we're going to see in 2016 summits, virtual conferences, and, on the topic. And I think it's just, a sign of a sub-discipline emerging. And I love what, Terry said, and I think Pam and others, that, we have an opportunity really to shape the DNA, so to speak, of the field in these early stages. We know it's easier to shape culture early on in an organizational life or in a team than it is later. And so having some thoughtful conversation, maybe we can take some learnings from the evolution of other fields and inject this space with a real rich, diversity of perspective and and just sort of, get it off, hopefully get this field off to a good start, early on, and building on the great work, pioneering work that's come before. But it seems like to me that team coaching is reaching kind of a tipping point, and we're going to see, in my view, my hypothesis, a little bit of an explosion on that. So exciting times. I think the topic of exploring core competencies in team coaching, exactly what we did today was exploring it, because it's not a one and done in an hour. So I'm sure we're going to be having more opportunities to talk about that in the future. So good stuff. I'm not sure I know, Alex, what theme popped out of today that warrants more exploration for the next month's webinar, but we will reflect on that. If you guys have suggestions, like Alex said, feel free to drop us an email. Thank you so much, Jen and Terry and Pam. Great having you here. We welcome you back on future webinars as well. And for all those who joined today, we are going to pop up a recording of this for replay in case you didn't get to hear the full recording, or if you didn't attend today, you'll get a chance to take part in the learning today as well. So with that, everyone, stay in the zone. Have a great rest of your day, and take care.